All right. Good morning. Let's get started. Happy Valentine's Day. I hope you're enjoying the day so far. If you've got fun plans or things to do, that's awesome. So glad to have you back for the 7th week of the quarter. Thank you for those of you that were able to turn in the first essay yesterday. Imagine a lot of folks are pretty burnt out and a little bit tired at this point in the quarter. From what I have heard and talked to folks about, I know that this is probably a challenging time. I know some folks were definitely burning some midnight oil to get it done, or have fallen a little bit behind, either using the card or still needing to turn that essay in late. So just please get that in to me as soon as you can. If you're not using the card, and if you're using the card, you're welcome to turn that in by the end of the day on Sunday with no penalty. So I do want to acknowledge that it's definitely a challenging time of the quarter, and I do want to try to make things reasonable and manageable for you. There is a second essay assignment, but I'll post the guidelines for that one later, and I'll give you a good amount of time to work on that, giving you kind of a 3-week window from when the prompt is up to when it's due. So I'll have that due on March 6th for you. So after class, I'll post it and then also post a Canvas update that lets you know a little bit more about that. But I just want to give you a good breather, but also a chance to prepare and start to think about things to do for that one. The second essay is going to ask you to relate to content in some of the more recent weeks, including listening as it relates to political and social issues, listening as it relates to things like race, as well as things like space and place in the listening process. So again, I think it's important to give you a bit of a buffer and also to acknowledge that this is usually the time in the quarter where a bunch of exams and other things are popping up. So I want to acknowledge that. So last class, we were talking a little bit about some of the ways that people use listening as it relates to political and social issues, including some of the different styles and areas where these 4 different formats are used. I had you all return to groups last week to explore how, if you managed a nonprofit or group such as funding student athletes, you might incorporate one of those different styles of listening into the participation of your group. As we went over last week, just as a quick recap, those 4 types of listening would include enclave, which would involve listening among people that have similar interests, such as being a member of a similar team. We'll talk a little bit about enclave listening and build on that for today in our discussion. Alliance listening, which has overlap, but isn't exactly the same. Adversarial listening, where you're listening to a perspective that you disagree with for the sake of strategy. And then transformative listening, which is focused more on getting the broader public to change their thought and way of addressing or dealing with an issue. So for this class, we talked a little bit about the second essay assignment and sort of the timeline in the quarter. Again, I know we're a little bit worn out, but I do want to give you good information and a good amount of time to start to think about and plan for this. So this week, our focus in our discussion is surrounding the topic of listening and race. Race and issues surrounding race can definitely be a challenging and politically charged area of discussion, right? If you saw the Super Bowl yesterday and halftime show, right, that is major discussion surrounding issues of race and identity. There's been, a lot of, you might say, discourse surrounding that show, its representations, the way that folks in attendance, for instance, Dr. Dre, Kendrick Lamar, Eminem, and others, right, performed, and how it relates to broader discussions and controversies surrounding race in the U.S. So I want to go into this discussion and the content this week, knowing that topics and issues related to race are difficult, right? They're challenging and they're very uncomfortable. And part of the point, I think, especially for folks who are white, is to deal with and engage with that discomfort as an opportunity to learn and to think about these topics more, right? It's an opportunity for us to sort of face and deal with that discomfort in a way that helps us to better understand, critically engage, and to support issues as they relate to race. This week's reading comes from Robert Redding Jr. He has a really kind of interesting background. You'll notice that this week's reading is a case study or extended example or focus on listening as it relates to Black-owned media in the United States. So this is an important issue, right? Because the goal of listening is an important topic to think about as we're engaging challenges surrounding race and similar issues. Right? That's it. Right, as we think about these issues, it's important for us to engage with the way that individuals from diverse backgrounds and perspectives listen, including the ways that media is impacted by the listening process. So this reading really gets at his own role in experience with radio and media. And while this is a pretty specific example looking at the history of Black-owned media in the United States and its broader impacts on society, I think that like level of specificity helps us understand broader questions and issues about how we use forms of media to listen and communicate with one another. This week's reading is called Black Voices, Red Power, Members of Black Press, the Meeting of Media Hegemony. The thesis here, right, the core idea or takeaway that we can gather from this week's reading is that when we include diverse and underrepresented voices in media, including things like radio, right, it can significantly improve our communication and understanding of diverse perspectives. But the institutional factors, institutional ownership and power, definitely play a really big role in the process as well, right? The idea here that while certainly having the voices of diverse perspectives included in the process and included in listening is important, it's also important to follow the money, follow the trail, and follow things like who owns or controls or impacts the press and the ways that we choose to communicate. So this is an important constraint for us to think about, that while media in the United States might involve people who use television show or radio and so on to represent and share experiences, that there is management, censorship, constraining, and so on that can affect that as well, right? That the mere representation is not enough. We also have to think about the role that power plays in that entire process. A core idea, and again, I like to use the first class each week to help to lay out some of the key topics and issues, is that of Afrocentrism, which is brought up several times in this week's article in relating to issues of race, right? And Afrocentrism deals with the idea that we can center, right, or put at the forefront issues and experiences regarding African and or Black communities, right? So I wanted to share a short clip from Dr. Arthur Carver, who helps to explain and situate this idea of Afrocentrism within the broader discussion of media and communication.
Dr. Carter, I was going to ask for a definition of Afrocentrism and why we need it.
Looking at the world from an African viewpoint, many of our textbooks, the lectures that are conducted from the university level through the K-12 system are really based on the European classics with very little mention of what Africa and what Africans have contributed to world civilization. So it's merely telling the truth about the development of world civilization. Africans played a tremendous part in the development of the world, from Kemet, which is known as Egypt. The first universities, the Temple at Luxor, was a university where the Greeks and others came to study. And so many times, we are told that democracy was born in Greece. Well, that's not quite true, or that mathematics came from Greece. Well, that's not true either. These African scholars, Black African scholars in Egypt, were teaching 3,000 years ago.
And not those fair Egyptians that we see in the textbooks sometimes.
Well, not the Liz Taylors
Yeah.
of the world. I mean, that's not that's not a good representation of the Egyptian life and culture.
So when we do complete that story, because that's what it really is just telling the complete history. Dr. Lewis, how does that translate in terms of self-esteem?
It has a tremendous impact on self-esteem. For an example, I was just telling a group last week at Macomb Community College, there is a word in the dictionary that's called negrophobia. And it means a tremendous hatred toward or a strong dislike of African descent people and African people. Imagine what a young precocious child may think of himself browsing through the dictionary and having to come upon that word. There's no Caucasian phobia, there's no Puerto Rican phobia, there's no Mexican American phobia. And if we exclude African Americans from history, then a person may think that he nor did his race make a contribution to civilization.
So, right, again, this is sort of a challenging relationship to a lot of current events and issues that we thought about as it relates to things such as textbooks and the ways that curriculum and education has been taught, right? There's been a lot of, I would say, a lot of discussion about topics that aren't actually understood or thought about. For instance, right, discussions about things like critical race theory, which is taught in little to no K-12 schools just as a basis. Is sort of a challenge, right? That a lot of the political discussion and heat surrounding these topics doesn't really engage with the specifics of what these ideas and concepts actually are. So an important thing for us to think about as we're engaging in issues of race is, when we have these conversations, what's left out, what's not included, what's not a part of the story or about the history. One important consideration here, right, is the way that, for instance, Black voices and perspectives might not be included when we're thinking about history as it relates to specific things over time. Who writes and who talks about or who situates history is an important consideration for us to think about too. That is, that populations of a lot of diverse backgrounds, enclaves, and perspectives have been included throughout history, and that as a result of that omission, right, we're not understanding or talking about those experiences, that the next generation or people who are trying to understand and follow history or background might lose out on that information. So for instance, the classic television series Roots, right, which involved story of an African-American trying to understand and engage with his heritage is an instance of trying to trace history that oftentimes has really major difficulty being found or understood. Another key idea here that gets brought up in this week's reading is the idea of hegemony, right? Hegemony is a term that you can think about that relates to a lot of different elements, including issues of international relations, which is where it gets used pretty widely. But hegemony can also be cultural, right? And impact things such as race, gender, identity, and so on. One example of this, although you could say that the United States' perspective has definitely shifted a bit over the past several years, right, is that the United States really tried to position itself as sort of a hegemon, right, or cultural, social, and political leader, that it had this sort of a larger impact on the entire world through things such as alliances, engagement, leadership, so on, right? And as a result of that, there is sort of examination of cultural hegemony as it relates to the US. Definitely seen some shifts in how hegemony might be defined or how it relates over the years. For instance, a shift from a more unipolar or singular system of leadership to a more bipolar or multipolar system, where leadership might be jockeyed with different countries, including China, right? And so hegemony has definitely shifted, but it is this idea of some level of dominance or control or influence. A really good example of cultural hegemony influence is Disney, right? Think about things such as Disney film movies, think about Marvel, Star Wars, and so on, right? Disney has this very kind of ubiquitous and large presence, not only means a streaming service and ownership, a lot of companies, but also in many ways has impacted a lot of the dialogue and discussions surrounding issues. For instance, tracking some of the most popular films and TV shows that come out, there's a good chance if you're looking through the top 10 list that you're going to see at least 3 or 4. In this way, Gemini has this level of control or power on the ways that we engage in dialogue, language, and similar discussions surrounding issues. So that if hegemony is cultural, right, it's about how different manners of speaking, engaging, or relating to the world are emphasized over others. So cultural hegemony is very much about how members of cultures assert some level of dominance, that there is a dominant culture, there might be countercultures or cultures responding to or addressing that role of power, and so on. This also comes from Stuart Hall's work in cultural studies, and we'll talk a little bit more about some of these ideas later. Additionally, another idea, right, that gets brought up and a term that gets kind of used continuously here as you're reading through and trying to understand some of the key ideas of this article is talking about the significance of African and African American storytelling, oral history, and sharing of experiences. So this gets brought up numerous times as you read through the article, and it kind of describes this idea of history of a troubadour historian, right? Or kind of with origins in West Africa, the idea that sharing and passing down oral histories and experiences, oftentimes doing so in an entertaining or engaging or thoughtful way, is a major part of communication. So applying that to a contemporary context, the use of Black-owned radio stations in the United States serves as a major way of sharing history, context, perspective, and experience. In this way, if we think back to last week in communication as it relates to social and cultural issues, right, we can think about how the role of enclaves or specific focused communities provides us with an opportunity to use media, including radio and so on, to tell stories, share information, and to convey elements of social reality, right? That we get perspectives and ideas that we don't otherwise have the opportunity to engage with. I wanted to share a video that helps us to understand a little bit of the history and context surrounding a Black-owned and operated radio station in the United States.
Hot 103 Jams, Kansas City, #1 for hip hop and R&B.
KPRS is currently known as Hot 103 Jams. At its inception, it was the first African-American owned radio station west of the Mississippi. It now has the distinction of being the oldest African-American owned and operated radio station in the entire United States.
The station is celebrating 70 years in Kansas City.
And still under the same family ownership. It all began with Andrew Skip Carter. He served 5 years in the U.S. Army, then became only the second African-American to get an FCC license. He founded KPRS in 1950 as an AM station with 3 business partners who eventually ceded control of the station to Carter and his wife, Millie. She's the one who pushed him to get an FM license. The AM station, KPRT, is now a gospel station. Eventually, the couple handed off ownership to their grandson, Michael Carter. That's him and Millie on the day it happened. Michael Carter has since been honored with various awards for community engagement. In 1996, Skip Carter was inducted posthumously into the Radio Hall of Fame. The Carter Broadcast Group continues to operate as a small family-owned radio group in an era of large commercial radio conglomerates.
So I thought this was a good and interesting example, right, to track sort of history and genealogy of this radio station. So examples like these, right, highlight the ways that using specific forms of media are able to engage with particular populations in unique ways. So for instance, in addition to radio, there might be the use of things like publications, such as magazines, right, or smaller articles that have definitely happened over the years as it's related to issues including gender, race, and identity. the use of physical spaces, right? Of space and places we'll talk about next week can be opportunities for listening and engagement for enclaves and communities as well. Obviously, with the use of internet and social media, there have been a lot of specific smaller groups or channels that have created unique opportunities to communicate as well. But a key idea here, right, is that when media is created and circulated, it can target and engage with enclaves as an opportunity for listening that might not otherwise be known or readily available. So kind of given some of these core ideas and elements, I want us to look into some of the history and context surrounding these issues a little bit more. So I'm going to split you into a few different groups. And what I want you to do is to look into and do a little bit of searching and research on your own into history and context surrounding Black-owned radio in the United States. Since this is sort of subject and case study that's analyzed for this reading, I think it's useful to get context. Secondarily, to think about why these radio stations might be important. What is their sort of overall significance based on the work and research that you're looking into? And also to look into what stations currently exist. So this is an opportunity for us to start to explore and to look into some of these topics in a little bit more detail. So it looks like we have 5, 6, 7, 8. So let's do a group of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Do a group of 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. And then we'll have partnership among the Zoom folks. Have one person write or type for your group and be prepared to share in just a little bit.
Yeah.
Currently exists.
Power 105.
Kind of just mixing up the core.
I don't know, like, when we did our papers, or talking about the leagues, saying like, Nick Saban and stuff like that, like, we able to actually see like, what we want to do is like, I want to bring you up, actually get to see somebody that was related to a lot of the allegations, like, some of the schools that they want to be, yeah, exactly. Or any other. Yeah, that also gives artists a chance to get their voices out.
Both pretty good. On the first section. Right here for a little bit. There was a time when black people greatly depended on black radio. Yeah, that's what it is. Versus accent.
And oh, yeah.
People about 10 more minutes or so to continue to work through this.
Oh. Oh.
Other
I bet the majority, like,
Oh,
Sounds like it's just finding out the job.
because like, oh.
So that's.
right.
Black radio played it. Yeah.
So I was a hot thing on this. It's a bar, 'cause they like the TV, and there's like something left, but they were still in the sport. It was a lot of screens for like 95 minutes. Yeah, I stand. Yeah, oh yeah. I think like Stafford earned it, Arnold earned one, and that was so good. I just want to judge that. Great. Oh, I know this part is so. Hmm. Yeah. Because they're just over the center on fair dog. Yeah. What's that one? Something. Foresight. And the linebacker, like, they were hitting like the backside where he was still making tackles. Like, it was kind of like they were doing that stretch concept. Somehow he linebacker was just like, yeah, yeah, it was tough. It was running back. I thought it made so much sense. So it was really cool. Mark Chase. Or no, that was. The Rams. Was he going crazy? I'm surprised.
We'll give you a few more minutes to continue working on this.
One more last year, right? Yeah. Yeah.
All right, so it sounds like we're sort of about done, so go ahead and close the breakout group here. Okay, looks like we have everybody back. Again, I wanted to give you a little bit more time since you all mentioned in feedback, having good time for some of these group activities is just a good way to prevent things from feeling too rushed. So I want to start by having each group share some of the things that they learned in answer to these questions, both in relationship to history, importance, as well as what's currently here. So why don't we start with the folks on Zoom? So what did you all discover?
I didn't know which question to answer, so I answered question 3. I didn't know if we were supposed to answer all 3. So what I wrote down was of the 10,000 FM AM radio stations, 168 are Black owned, and then some of the most popular radio stations are V103 Atlanta, Chicago, New York City, Dallas, Power 99 Philly, Los Angeles, and then there's a lot more across the US.
Mhm.
So that's what
Okay.
I had down.
Sure, thanks for sharing. This group here on the side.
So we found. So what we found was the first Black-owned radio station in the United States actually started in 1949 in Atlanta with a station called WERD.
Mhm.
And a lot of the early stations were less focused on music and more kind of news and cultural broadcasting.
Mhm.
This really picked up, especially during the civil rights era,
Mhm.
especially in the southern United States, where a lot of, due to segregation, a lot of Black communities were culturally isolated. These stations kind of provided a way to get the news in, they kind of provide a sense of cohesion.
Mhm.
And another thing we also picked up on was, I guess due to their prevalence, the Black DJs became something of inspirations for younger generations, especially leading into the civil rights era.
Mhm. Awesome. Yeah, do you have anything else to add, or is that sort of the main things that you, yeah, awesome. So I really appreciate you sharing. I think some really important kind of major takeaways there, right? First of all, history and context. There's a good chance that prior to this class, a lot of people didn't really know the history or weren't necessarily taught kind of the history and context about radio stations in the South, and as it relates to issues like segregation, there's significance to talking about and addressing sorts of issues. Also, kind of tying back to the video we saw earlier, right? The idea of that history or context or centering perspectives through things like radio as a way for younger generations to feel inspired or understood or included in the context of history, I think is an important consideration too. That is, one major takeaway we can get is that when we listen, we understand our own sort of place in history or place in the world, right? That listening is a chance for us to gain insight and context into our lived experiences and our perspective. There's a reason, for instance, that things like those like ancestry websites, DNA tests, genealogy, and so on is so popular. So because by us listening to or understanding and reading the results, we come to understand our own context about who we are, where we come from, and our own background. So thanks for sharing. Let's hear from this group over here. What did you all figure out in relation to these questions?
Things that we found that weren't already said is that there were Black-owned stations, so like in the 1920s, 30s, and early 40s, Black audiences, they only had like radio programs specifically for them, like a few hours a week, so very minimal and very scattered.
Mhm.
And then Black-owned radio stations are important because they kind of, like you're saying, they help to connect the community and raise up and support Black voices that won't necessarily be heard on other stations, or give people the chance to speak that won't get the same platforms. It also gives more opportunities for Black artists, I guess, to like share their music or their talents, as opposed to like the big ones, the big Black music artists that are already like streaming on mainstream radio stations, and those stations will consider it good, like they have their diversity, but it's only their big people.
Mhm.
And then for current Black-owned radio stations, we also found that a lot of them are concentrated in the southern part of the US,
Mhm.
and they're only distributed throughout 30 states.
Interesting. Okay. Right. So it's interesting to track not only some of the changes in demographics and quantity of stations and where they're located over time, but also, Lacey, as you brought up for your group, right, that they're able to serve specific localities. So when we think about listening more broadly, including the use of media, radio, and so on, right, it's targeted. It is maybe constrained by your ability to tune into the station and the location, but also, even if there's media like TV shows and movies that are technically directed toward an entire audience, there might be a particular following or group of people that are more likely to pick up on and follow it. Right? So I really appreciate you all adding that perspective. Again, I wanted to do some initial work and research into the history and context about this, because I think it'll provide us with a good way of exploring reading and understanding some key ideas there. So I did want to use time today to go over some of the key terms and things that I think will help you to gain a better understanding of the reading. So before we wrap up, I did want to share the essay prompts for today that are available on Canvas. So again, as I mentioned before, there is the second essay assignment that is going to be due on March 6th. That is about 3 weeks from today. That way, we'll have plenty of time to start to think through, workshop and brainstorm this assignment, and hopefully have a little bit of a breather after turning this last one in. So if you scroll down under week 9, see it's listed here. So the second essay is like the first one, 4 pages, Times New Roman, standard font and margins, also worth the same number of points. Again, these are different prompts that relate to things that we've been talking about in the week since. So some of the things on the table include listening as it relates to things like media, culture, gender, and identity, media and listening as it relates to race, and some of the ways that listening engages with social and political issues. This, again, you have 3 prompts to choose from. Pick any one of the 3 that you find interesting or you feel like you're an expert on. One that's about the role of culture, right? So I'm asking you to compare 2 different readings that define and discuss culture and explaining how they relate to things like race and gender, and the ways that cultural differences can impact how we listen to one another. The second reading is about, or the second prompt is about how people use listening in social and political issues. So you can think back to last week, and particularly our discussion last week about these 4 different styles of listening that we use in social and political situations. Then I'm asking you to think about their goals and also bring in a different reading that adds to our understanding of listening in public situations. So for instance, you might apply an issue about culture and the way that culture impacts public listening, something that connects pretty well to the things that you brought up for today. And then lastly, we'll get into space and place next week, the way that things like physical or digital location impact the listening process, and the way that we gain significance from that situation. So you'll be able to explore that, look at space, place, and listening, and understand how that impacts the listening process. So these 3 prompts are available. Again, this content we're going over this week. And next week, that'll help to inform which prompt you choose. You're welcome to choose the one that's most interesting. And once again, I'll look over rough drafts and outlines if you want to send them to me. And you can use the makeup, or you can use the get out of jail free card if you choose to wait and submit it later. The regular deadline is going to be on March 6th. So yeah, 3 weeks out. So to wrap up for today, we went ahead and talked a little bit about issues surrounding race, media, radio, and so on, right? Again, I know that getting into discussions surrounding the role of race and listening can be challenging. It's a challenging set of issues to think about. So I think it's important for us to approach it from the perspective of us. We're learning about listening and some of the ways that we can use and engage with listening as it relates to a lot of these challenges. Talk a little bit about history and context and some of the ways that they've shaped our understanding of things like race, including this idea of Afrocentrism, and the role of media in the listening process, including the work that you all brought in looking at the sort of history of radio stations. So for next class, we will get into further issues surrounding the role of listening as it relates to this week's reading. So if you haven't already, I have one person who has your prompt for today with everybody's names on it. I've emailed or sent over to me. Once you have that, you're welcome to head out. I hope you have a great Monday and rest of your week. Hopefully you get a little bit of rest and a breather after everything that you've had going on. And I'll see you all again on Wednesday.
Bye.
I have like 50 of them, so it's fine.
I'll catch up with you.